everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Don Hendy. I actually had a look at my little logbook just to see when I started diving. So I started in '86 with BSAC, and I've been with them ever since. I'm a cold water diver, dive 12 months of the year, and try and dive as often as possible. Career-wise, I went to an art school and studied photography and television. I worked on some cruise ships as my first job for a couple of years, came back to the UK. I joined Dorset Police as a scenes crime photographer and did that for quite a few years. We started up a video unit at Dorset Police, which we ran for a few years. And then I joined a company called TVS, which was an ITV company that covered the south of England. I was with them for about 20 years. It changed to a company that we now know as Meridian. And I did news and sports and documentaries. And obviously in that time, worked for a lot of different companies. You'll see on the screen my little logo. I think it was about 1990. I started up an underwater video company. Back then you had to be health and safety part 4, which I was. I worked for terrestrial companies, the RNLI, you name it. I did loads and loads. I sort of gave up when technology forced me to give up, probably in about the year 2000. Professionally, I still hire out kits occasionally, but now all of the work I do is mainly for myself, and I try and do VR underwater filming. Just a quick just a quick shout out to anybody that if you enjoy this evening and this sort of webinar piques your interest in the history of underwater videography and underwater photography, then I suggest and encourage you to go to the Diving Museum at Gosport. It's an amazing place. They've got absolutely loads of exhibits, including lots of underwater videography and photography equipment. It's a fantastic place. It's run by an amazing group of volunteers, and they bring the museum and all of the exhibits to life. So, as I said, if this webinar piques your interests, then pop down. You're also welcome to have a look at the Historical Diving Society. They are the first and the largest historical diving societies in the world. They're affiliated with lots of different other historical diving societies across Europe and so on and so forth. So have a look at them. It's a great organization. We have conferences every year, haven't done for a couple of years. This year it's via Zoom, but the conferences are really interesting. So have a look at that. Someone asked a little bit earlier that they had a GoPro and would this talk be relevant to them? And yes, I need to make it clear, I'm not a representative of Paralens or GoPro. I'm very grateful to Paralens and GoPro for allowing me to use their medium and marketing material, but I have no interest. I'm not here to sell you equipment. The reason I mention these two cameras is because as far as the UK and Europe is concerned, they are the two most popular cameras. So if you're out on a boat and you're looking around to see if people have got cameras, invariably it will be a GoPro or a Paralens. I will talk about other housings and other cameras, but as I said, these two are the most popular. So I'm going to focus not so much on the cameras, but on the features and what you can do with them. This talk is a very compressed version. I belong to a couple of clubs in the South Coast, one of those being South Sea-Sub-Aqua in Portsmouth. We try to run video workshops for members. We have done over the last few years, but that workshop lasts 2 days. So you can imagine that tonight is quite a compressed version. When we do run it, it's obviously been face-to-face, and I ask lots of questions, try and keep people awake. And as prizes for some of those questions, if they get them right, they obviously get celebrations. We can't do that tonight, so I'm working on the assumption that a lot of you will get the questions right, and therefore I can eat the chocolate. So well done in advance, and thank you. Tonight we're going to look at really people that are thinking about trying underwater filming, people that are thinking about buying the kit, and someone who's just maybe bought one this year or a year ago and hasn't really had an opportunity to play with it. As with anything to do with diving or any sport or hobby, there are no real right and wrong ways to go about how you approach underwater filming. We'll obviously talk about safety, and none of this negates the need to dive safely. But if someone says you have to have this camera, or you have to do it this way, or you have to shoot with this lens, don't listen to them. You'll find the kit and the right way for you to do it. There is a lot of equipment out there, so don't be in a rush to go out and spend your hard-earned money straight away. Take the time to think about what you're going to buy, how you're going to use it, where you're going to use it, and so on and so forth. As always, and with diving, beg and borrow if you can. If you're lucky enough to have full nights, and hopefully they'll return for a lot of us, then if you've got friends and colleagues and members of the club that you can borrow, have a play with it, see what you like about them, see possibly what you don't like about them. As I said, I'm not going to tell you how to suck eggs as far as diving, and I'm not going to tell you what equipment to buy and so on and so forth. I would strongly encourage you, though, to talk to other users and glean as much information you can from them as possible. Read articles, watch tutorials, invest as much time as you can, and I promise you it will pay dividends. Find what works for you and what you want to do. So tonight we're going to have a quick look at a very brief history of underwater filming and some of its early pioneers. We're going to look at cameras, what to look for, some of the terminology, because as with most things, people love acronyms and terminology, so we'll try and cut through some of that. We'll look at underwater housings. We're going to look at light and why it's important for us. And then we're going to look at the practicalities of underwater filming. So, early pioneers, and I guess really we should start with these two guys, William Henry Fox Talbot and Louis Daguerre. Now, people will often argue, and when I say people, I mean English people and French people, about who invented or was the father of photography. I think it's fair to say that they both did, and roughly about the same time. William Henry Fox Talbot came from a place called Laycock in Dorset. Quite an intelligent man. I think he was a graduate of Cambridge, was a member of Parliament for a time, and he had a lot of scientific interests. Louis Daguerre was also partly involved in science, also an artist, and they both were working around about the same time, 1835 to 1840, with creating what we now know as photosensitive materials. Fox Talbot worked with creating photosensitive paper, and that was using salt and silver nitrate, whereas Louis Daguerre used metal sheets. But really, it was about 1840 when they both came to the same results and created photosensitive materials, whether it be paper or metal. So, a question: when was the world's first underwater photograph? And yes, well done. I can hear a lot of you shouting out the right answer, so that's several chocolates for me. Well done. The first underwater photograph was 1856. And it was actually taken not far from a very popular dive place for us in the UK, which was Weymouth and Portland. William Thompson, who was an engineer and a merchant in Weymouth, built the first known underwater housing and used it in Weymouth Bay. Now, there's a lot of different opinions about where he used it. Some people say it was White Regis in Portland Harbour, but it does. It is a nice feeling that when you drive through Weymouth and you drive into Portland, that actually the first photograph was taken. But you can see, hopefully, you can see something there. It's very blurry, and that's because the material, although it's photosensitive, was still quite crude, and the exposure time was about 10 minutes. So it's amazing that he recorded anything at all. The housing itself was made of wood, metal fittings, and it used glass plates. And the shutter was activated by a line to the surface. And supposedly the depth was about 18 feet, which is, as you can see there, 5.5 meters. So the first underwater photograph taken in Weymouth in 1856. The world's first underwater selfie, and that was 1899. And that's the photograph there. I hasten to add, it's not a selfie stick. It's a pole to keep him underwater and as still as possible. That photograph is a man called Louis-Marie Auguste Boutin. He was a biologist by trade and studied natural history at the University of Paris and at the Maritime Research Station in the south of France. He worked all around the world, spent a considerable amount of time in Australia and the Pacific. And his work as a biologist and zoologist led him to want to capture images of the undersea world. So on the right-hand side, you can see there a drawing of it being moved around. Obviously, it was, even with the air inside, incredibly heavy, and you needed a barrel to move it around. It was often described as crude, which I think is not representative. It was quite an incredible piece of engineering for the time. You can see there that it's got lenses, it's got the ability to work the shutter. So anything but crude, really. 1899, Louis Vuitton takes his famous photo. Supposedly it was meant to be of him, but I think it is actually of another biologist friend and colleague. But this photograph, I think, is acknowledged as the first underwater photographic portrait. Obviously, even in the south of France, Louis Vuitton struggled with light underwater. And so he was the first to develop an underwater strobe. And you can see here with the description, it says consisting of a bulb filled with oxygen-enriched air and a magnesium filament that is situated in an alcohol lamp. The barrel had the oxygen-enriched air. You can see in the diagram there that there are a huge amount of weights to keep it down. And how it ever didn't explode with magnesium and all the rest of it, how he managed to control that, I'll never know. He was later to go on to develop carbon arc lamps, which he used for underwater photography. Moving on to 1903, Charles Williamson creates the first submarine tube. He created it purely for the purposes of underwater salvage. I don't think much came of it, and I don't think it was very successful. I think they tried to use it on several wrecks, trying to recover material, but I don't think it, as I said, was that successful. By all accounts, he was an avid inventor, probably a bit like our James Dyson. coming up with all sorts of inventions. And as you can see in the diagram there, we've got some helmets and arms tubing out. The tube itself was a series of concentric rings, and the outer tube was a waterproof fabric, and it could extend up to 250 feet. But as I said, I don't think this was very successful. Charles Williamson had two sons. One of them, John, who was a reporter, worked on the East Coast of America, and his brother George. Both of them were avid photographers, and I think it was John that saw the possibilities of using the Williamson tube for photographic reasons. So they changed the underwater apparatus so that they could create a sphere, a photosphere, which you can see sketch over on the left-hand top picture. And here you can see what it looks like for the cameraman inside. I think they tried and experimented with it on the East Coast, but obviously the viz and the light was poor, and so it was mainly used in the Bahamas and Florida. I think they ventured into filmmaking, but certainly this in 1916, this was their first underwater film, and it's the first of many versions of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And we'll have a little look at that. I'm sure my friends from the Diving Museum will probably point out that I've got this wrong, but you'll notice that the actors are using the Hall Reese-Davis independent breathing apparatus. They also were the first to use special effects underwater. You can see in the left, the octopus actually had a diver in, moving the arms around. I think if you look up at the top right, it says that the patent was 1921. I don't know about patent law, but possibly after 100 years it lapses. So this might be a moment for someone to take up the mantle, Dragon Den's moment. But yeah, whether it was ever used again after the film, I don't know. So we'll have a quick look at a clip from this. So, obviously, probably looks a bit crude to us today. We're quite sophisticated viewers, but when you consider that was over 100 years ago, I think it's pretty incredible. You'll look there and see some iconic figures from the big screen, 1930. This was quite a Renaissance period and quite, a dramatic upping of standards as far as films was concerned. So when you think that underwater film was made in 1916, I think it's absolutely amazing. Going to mention Jean Painlev. He was a diver, He was a scientist, biologist. And I think what's interesting about Jean-Pain Lev is not only did he film in the sea, but he brought the sea into the studio. And it's the first time that we've actually got people that are bringing large aquariums and so on and so forth into their studios and managing that process. And it's obviously been replicated thousands of times since then, but this was the first occasion where someone brought the sea life onto the studio. Quickly moving on to Charles William Beebe. Same again, I think he was a naturalist and zoologist. And it was 1934 that both him and Otis Barden made it down to 900 odd meters. I think this was an important moment because they recorded, or soon to record, the fact that there was so many different species of animals down there. So up until then, we had a very, very, very limited knowledge of, the oceans and the life in it. And these two and those pioneers that traveled deep and recorded what they saw really changed the world as far as marine oceanography is concerned. As we move through the ages, you can see here different cameras, different film sets. You'll notice that the cameras are still absolutely huge, and that's because the cameras are still using a 35mm film. So the spools themselves are fairly large, 30 to 60 centimeters across, depending on the length. So the housings were representative of the cameras, and invariably they were large. Can't really talk about pioneers without talking about Lottie and Hans Haas. I think I'd like to say I'm a bit too young, and they probably were a bit before my time, but they certainly brought a glamour to diving. You have to remember that TV wasn't around, or certainly was in its infancy. So underwater programs, people still, films, people would have to go to the cinema to watch them. So without people like Lottie and Hans Haas and some of the works that they created, people would have had no idea about the underwater world. Valerie Taylor, Ron Taylor. I think Valerie Taylor is still active. She must be in her 80s. Yeah, looking down there. I think last year there might have been a documentary brought out about her. And they were instrumental in bringing some of these films to the screen. And they were avid cinematographers. Obviously, my biggest influence, and probably was for a lot of people, was Jacques Cousteau. I was trying to remember when it was that I used to watch the program, and for some reason I've got it in my head that it used to be on a Sunday evening. But I used to be absolutely enthralled with Jacques Cousteau and the way, his quiet, gentle way of talking and presenting and talking about the undersea world. It was absolutely amazing. So we'll just have a quick look at one of their first ventures in the south of France.
We first tested the aqualung in the summer of 1942 on the French Mediterranean coast with my friends Frédéric Dumas and Philippe Taillet. At that time, we had no idea how it would change all our lives. Later on, we would add new sophisticated equipment. But the important thing was that now the diver was free, and safety was in freedom.
So that was them filming, I think, one of his first films, or his first film, which was 10 Fathoms Deep. If you're interested in Jacques Cousteau, and you haven't seen this film, The Odyssey, by a French director, Jérôme Salle, I thoroughly recommend it. think it's fair to say that Jacques Cousteau was a complex man, but he was an incredible pioneer. And yeah, I can't imagine the world without him. So if you get the chance, watch this film. So as I said, Jacques Cousteau was very prolific as far as filmmaking, making programs, made them all around the world, as we know. Moving on to the 50s and 60s, I wasn't around, I'm glad to say, at that time, but I've seen them all. Literally, The Silent Enemy, I saw repeated a couple of nights ago. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Hopefully some of you will have seen these. Some of you will remember seeing them possibly for the first time when they came out. 60s and 70s. Thunderball, probably one of my favourite films, especially the diving fight sequence at the end. So you can see that underwater films have been part of popular culture and certainly part of the film industry for a long time. It's surprising when you actually start to do a search for films, how many films there have been which are either completely about the underwater world or have lots of scenes in them. 60s and 80s, I can say that 4 of those I used to watch avidly. Sea Hunt, I didn't, but I know that was very popular. Certainly Stingray and the Man from Atlantis, I used to watch avidly. So even as far as TV is concerned, underwater programs have always had a big presence. Many of you will have seen Jaws. Everybody probably will have seen Jaws. I know it had a big impact on me. I remember the first time I went swimming after seeing it, and the sea was quite calm, and I swam quite a way out, and rapidly swam back in. So Jaws has always stuck with me, and probably has with a lot of people. What's interesting though is the writer Peter Benchley, certainly in the last few decades of his life, said about the fact that if he'd had the chance, he would have never written the book, because Jaws probably did start, a few decades of people mindlessly killing sharks and so on and so forth. So I don't know that he regrets it. Spielberg regrets making the film. And it's strange in that Ron and Valerie Taylor, and to a degree, Lottie and Hans Haas, were avid spearfishers, spearfisher men and women. Ron Taylor and Valerie used to hunt for sharks, but in their later life, it was a complete polar opposite for them. And all of them became avid conservationists. And I would imagine that's because they, more than anybody, had an opportunity to see the damage that climate change and pollution and so on and so forth had played on the oceans. So certainly in their later years, they changed certainly their views. Can't really not mention The Abyss, very popular film. I'm going to whiz through some of these now so that we can concentrate. If you haven't seen The Abyss, I would say watch The Making of The Abyss. That's probably more interesting than Divers than the actual film. Pinewood Studios, very, it's the iconic home of English film. Pinewood for quite a few years has had one of the largest exterior tanks in Europe. We've also got the underwater stage, or the U stage as it's referred to. That's managed by a company called Diving Services UK. An amazing guy called Dave Shaw started up the company early 2000. You can see here the pool, 20 meters long, 10 meters wide, 6 meters deep, has viewing windows. I'm just going to quickly show you the trailer for a film called Pressure, made by a guy called Juan Scalpello. And if you haven't seen it, definitely seek it out and watch it. So a British film, made at Pinewood. You can see there a photograph from the set. You can see that there are black drapes all the way around the outside. It looks incredibly clean. It is filtered, heated, and so on and so forth. Occasionally, they have tours. So if you ever see or get the opportunity to go, I thoroughly recommend it. It's amazing. New Planet, absolutely amazing. We could spend weeks talking about it. If you haven't seen it, I'm sure everybody has, then please check it out. So cameras, they've changed obviously enormously, got smaller, become digitized, and now we're down to handheld size equipment. As I said, I'm not here to sell the GoPro. I'm not here to sell the Paralens. I'm not saying that you should go out and buy them, but they are the two most popular cameras around. We could spend ages looking at the difference between them, the pros and possibly the cons. Certainly not the cons, but the differences. The only difference is a difference in price. Some people think that's well worth the money. All I'd say is that if you've got colleagues and friends with either a GoPro or a Paralens, then make every effort to have a play with one, whether in the pool or actually in the lake or the same. Lenses, obviously, the lenses are invariably wide. If we look at this diagram here, you'll see a descriptor of wide angle, normal, up through to telephoto. And normally the lenses will live in this range here, anywhere between 8 and 16. So with a lot of cameras, you will have a very wide angle. That's fine because it absorbs a lot of the movement, and invariably if you want to move or if you want to get closer in, or certainly make the shot tighter, then it's just a case of moving into the subject. Some people will talk about sensors and megapixels. If you've ever taken a GoPro apart or an underwater camera, ever dunked one, which I have several times, you'll see that the largest part of it is actually the lens. They all work in a similar way, but with a GoPro style model, we've obviously got the light going through the lens. There will be internal lenses which focus the image onto the sensor, so that the light and the image will pass through that lens. It will hit the sensor, and then it will be processed, and that processed data will be sent as an image to the viewfinder and as information to the SD or micro SD card, as it normally is. Don't get hung up on sensor sizes. Traditionally, it was important, with some cameras like the Canon 5D and these professional type cameras, you needed the full frame sensor to get that quality. Nowadays, the algorithms, the processing power of the cameras, such as the GoPro and the Paralens, means that you can achieve high def and 4K quality images with a relatively small size sensor. Don't get too hung up on, whether it's 2.3K or 4K and so on and so forth. Think about the format or the platform that it's going to end up, and invariably that's going to be a website, whether it be YouTube or a club web page. So I've heard people talking about, I need a 6K camera and it's only going to end up on YouTube. You don't need to worry about that, so don't get too hung up. Invariably, the sensor and the camera will produce quite large files, and to cope with the higher resolution, will come across different codecs. Now, invariably, it's normally MPEG, which has been a codec that's been around for absolute years. Now, what we're seeing is we're seeing formats like RAW. And RAW is a term to describe unprocessed footage that comes straight from the sensor. So when I'm working as a cameraman, I work with RAW, and when you look at RAW footage directly, it looks pretty awful because it's not had any ultra exposure dealt with it, it's not been color corrected, and RAW is a format that you have to work with if you want high resolution. So I'd be inclined to just leave and stick with MPEG. And certainly when you're using the camera, let the camera do the work. All of the cameras nowadays are so clever, and, they'll do a lot of the work that some people do in post. So yeah, leave it as an MPEG. The problem is, the fact is that if you're dealing with larger file sizes, it will take up more space. And you can see in the bottom there, the space calculator, that a normal 720 by 576 picture equates to 6 gigabytes. You can see that a raw 4K version is 50 gigabytes. So if you inadvertently switch the format to RAW, it will easily halve the time on your SD card. So always check that you're on the codec that you want it to be. Invariably, we deal with, for most cameras, micro SD cards. If you've got photographic type camera or a larger video camera in a housing, you might have to deal with fast cards, C cards, but invariably you'll be using micro SD cards. Make sure that you get the right card for the job. The card on display here is a SanDisk. I use SanDisk, but there are Lexar, there are lots of other good mates. So same again, I'm not trying to sell SanDisk. But make sure that your card is going to be able to cope with the format and the data that you need to put on it. You'll see there that there's actually a lot of important information, such as the speed that the camera will write to that SD card, and so on and so forth. If that you find confusing, and certainly with some of the micro SD cards, there's a lack of information. If, for example, you have a GoPro, then just go to the GoPro site, type in the model that you've got, and it will tell you the most appropriate cards to get for that model. So don't try and find that yourself. Just go to one of the support hubs for the camera. Stabilization, optical or digital. Some video cameras have optical, but virtually 90% of underwater cameras now, it's digital. Whether you have it on or not, that's entirely up to you. Stabilization, if you do it on the camera, will crop the outside of the visible recorded frame, and that will allow the picture to be buffered and moved around to try and absorb some of that. You can do that in the editing process as well, if it's really bad. Battery strength is important. Obviously, larger sensors and the larger and faster processors are going to require a lot more energy. So think about the battery. Think about how you look after the battery. The batteries don't like the cold. So, if you can keep them in your pocket or as close to your body as for as long as possible, certainly, when we're going through the winter and autumn months, keep those batteries away from cold temperatures. ISO is a feature that's still found on some cameras, and it's an old term, I guess, in some respects, and it referred to the speed and the sensitivity of photographic film, and it's still a term that is used. So, for example, if you can see there, you had a 400 ISO film, that would be for everyday use. You can see on the right is a 1600 film, and that would mean that you could work in darker, murkier conditions because it was faster. And that applies to video as well. ISO and the electronic ISO is around. Basically, it's a form of amplification. And the only way I can describe it is to say that if you're playing, some music and it's really quiet, you turn the volume all the way up, you'll start to hear white noise and hiss. And that's because you're amplifying everything to a high level. And it's exactly the same with ISO. There is a tendency for some people to put as much ISO and exposure helping as possible. But unfortunately, it will just cause, visible distortions. Basically, it's the equivalent of that white noise in the background. You're amplifying not only the decent sound, but all of that inherent noise in the background. So be careful with ramping that up too much. Prices. So I talked about the Paralens and the GoPro. There are loads of other different cameras out there. You can see the Viho Movie, Olympus, Garmin make a camera. These may be more suitable for you. Have a look at them. Most outdoor shops and dive shops normally keep a range of these. If you're really unsure, then I would recommend that you just buy something cheap and cheerful just to play with. We've all bought diving kit that we've never used again, and it's sat there. And what you don't want to do is spend hundreds of pounds on film equipment, videography equipment, and for it to never be sat there. So, it won't hurt to just start gently and cheaply. As far as prices are concerned, you can go to the far end. So this is a professional cinematography camera. It's called an Arri Alexa. And with that and the lens and the housing, that would come to about £110. But no lights, surprisingly. Can't imagine there are many people out there that are going to buy an Arri Alexa, but if you are, please let me know, because I'd love to come have a play. Coming down to a slightly more manageable level, is the ability to have cameras like these. This is a camera I use daily. It's called Blackmagic cinema camera, and it records 6K. The body and the lens comes to about £1,500, so it's sort of affordable. The expensive part actually is the housing. So a Nauticam housing is going to push it up to £7,000. So that's still a huge amount of money for people. You can buy standalone cameras that you can use on the surface as well as underwater. These range in prices from 1,000, down to 500. But you don't tend to see people with those. It's quite rare and far and few between when you see that. If you want to do a kit, I have made a kit before. So I bought a light torch, a knockoff GoPro and a housing, and what's called a wind guard, and that would enable you to film and have a torch, and that came to about £20. So as I said, if you're starting out and you're unsure, then don't spend a great deal of money. Housing. So not everybody goes for GoPros, Paralens, and those types of cameras. Some people that enjoy that want to have the ability to control the equipment and the camera far more. So let's have a look at housings. Going back to the 30s right through to the 80s, you can see large-scale cameras, cinematography, professional cameras are huge, absolutely enormous. And so are the rigs that you have to put them on and control them. And therefore, the housings are just going to be representative of how large they are. So you can see how large this beast is here. Here's a scene with two cameras. And you can see the weights on the top. They're not buoys, they're weights to keep them down. Favorite film of mine, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And you can see that's a fairly small housing for 1954, but it's still huge. Certainly, about the 1930s, we see people starting to use 16 mil. So obviously the housings are still small, but certainly as far as feature films are concerned, housings were and still are enormous. None more so than for IMAX cameras and 3D cameras. Not that we see them that much nowadays. So we can see that over time, 1927 to 2021, the change in size and ergonomics and, it's just its physicality is absolutely huge. Occasionally you see 3D cameras, but that's certainly a phase that seems to have died down again. But they were always going to be large because you've got two cameras. Something that I'm interested in is VR underwater filming, and the Pix Pro here is literally just holding the hand. It's absolutely dinky. People have made their own housings. People often used to make their own housings, and there's nothing to stop people making their own housings. I'm not sure if I would want to, but yeah, certainly the Amphibicos and some of the other makes, they were in essence plastic tubes, polyurethane tubes. The first camera, and this was my first housing and a housing that I used for years and years, was a Sony, which I think was a branded CNC housing actually. And that type of camera was quite popular, but you'll notice the big flaw with these cameras is the fact that they all use sports finders, which were okay, but you used to have to shoot very wide to, feel assured that you'd got everything in. Certainly, when I used to do underwater work, you'll notice here that on top of the housing is a monitor, an underwater monitor, and you've got a couple of outputs, one that feeds the video to the monitor and one that feeds the output to the surface. And in this instance, this was ITV's first ever live underwater broadcast. And you'll notice that turtle, and that turtle was a nightmare. It spent the whole time moving the underwater lights and trying to chew through cables. So yeah, it was like a naughty, mischievous dog. We're so lucky now that all of the housings that we've got the ability to see the picture on the back. If you want, there are still a lot of amazing housings out there which will house high-end photographic cameras, high-end video cameras. I've used Gates, Amphibico, and Nauticam, and they are lovely, but they are a huge amount of money. And the trouble is the housing will normally fit one specific type of camera or one brand of camera, which for cameramen is quite difficult, because if you're working for different production companies, they'll want you to use different types of cameras, which means, you could end up technically buying 3 or 4 different houses, which is, nonsense and no one's going to do. So nowadays it's unusual to see these. These are normally just from rental companies and for high-end productions. But saying that, the larger housings do give you far more control. So you've got control over zoom, exposure, white balance, and you can obviously change lenses. So they give you so much more flexibility. The problem is, as we said, the costs are far larger and they're physically and technically a lot more difficult to handle. So we've got light and why it has an impact on us. And we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Light obviously has what's called different color temperatures, and you probably will have noticed this if you're going to B&Q and they've got bulb displays, lamp displays, and you'll notice that some are warm and some are cold, and that's because they've got different color temperatures. Cameras, well, certainly our eyes naturally adjust to those different temperatures. Cameras have to think about it. Certainly in the water, light changes as we go deeper, and it diminishes as we go deeper. So at 2 meters or on the surface, light is pouring in, and you can see all the colors, that, the majority of the colors that make up that wavelength. They're absolutely fine. Get down to 10 meters, and you can see that the red's gone, and that we're left with orange and yellows and the greens and blues, but you can see a massive change just in that 10 meters. And as we all know, if you go down to 40, 50 meters, and certainly in the UK, it's just washed out. Invariably at that depth, it's just green and sludgy. If you want to see a proper explanation of that, then I suggest you watch Forces of Nature with Professor Brian Cox, episode 4. That's an interesting program. If we haven't got lights, how do we cope? Well, we can either use filters or we can do it in post-production. Filters, I'd steer away from. They're fine in warm, clear waters, but certainly for the UK, they don't tend to work. And the problem is also with the red filters, they'll work at a certain depth. But if you go beyond that or above that, then you end up with a colour hue. So certainly as far as the UK is concerned, and depending on your diving and the profile, then I'd steer away from using filters. And also, the camera is struggling to get enough light down there anyway. So think about that. If you put a lens in front of it, that's another possible one stop that's not making its way to the sensor. Post editing, grading is useful. There's no need for extra equipment, and you can use it on all the footage and save those preferences to apply to all of them. But the problem is, especially for me, and possibly others like me, it's a new skill to learn and new software to acquire. So it may not be for everybody. Lights, we'll whiz through lights a little bit. You can see, as we said, Louis Vuitton created the first electric lights. They've been used ever since then on all different sorts of productions. There are a myriad of different torches out there. Just think about the lumens, i.e. the strength, and the throw. Those are two things that will invariably be part of the spec for a light. And throw is just the distance and the strength of that light. So you can see here, obviously there's someone holding a torch to our left and pointing it onto that enemy. But you can see that light is not traveling any further. You can see on the photo on the right a little sea creature, but you can see literally within 10 to 20 mil behind it, that light is diminishing. So that's what we've described as throw, the ability of light and the distance that it will cover. Backscatter, we're always going to have backscatter problems in the UK. There aren't many times when there isn't something in the water. And the easiest and the quickest way to get around that is to move the light off and at an angle from the lens. So if you keep the lens in front of it, you will invariably have problems. So that does mean that you need to get arms of some sort They can be cheap. You see in the bottom left, that's probably quite an expensive rig. But if you shop around, speak to people, you can find cheaper ways to get over that. Equipment care, hopefully, shouldn't need to talk about this a great deal. Do you want to spend £5 to save £7,000? Hopefully you see the logic in that. Looking after stuff, obviously with all of this, you need to look after it. Keep the lens clean. Clean it before, clean it afterwards. Make sure that you've got a proper lens cover. The lenses, and especially the lens housings or the camera housings, they're invariably a plastic, and so they don't take kindly to being put in BCDs, because you've got, quite abrasive nylon material. So if you haven't got a cover for the lens, then put it in a cloth bag and then put it back in your BCD. Cases, yeah. Keep it safe, and especially on hard boats and ribs and stuff like that. So we'll have a quick look through some of these. This is a straw poll. There's nothing scientific about it whatsoever, but over the years I've asked people these same questions, and shockingly, there are a huge amount of people that use their camera but do nothing with it. And I don't know why that is. Are people scared of the editing process? Are they not happy with the software they've got? I'm not sure. When you come back, archive your material. So save it to a workable hard drive and then save it to an archive disk as well. And then clean the disk down. There's nothing worse than you filming some rare species fish and then taking that micro SD card out the next week and recording over. These are sorts of things that we've all come across, fail to plan and so on and so forth. Who's the video for? When you go out, ask yourself why and what you want to achieve. Why are you taking that camera down with you, and what do you want to come back with? And you need to think about that to a degree. You need to give that some thought. And the only analogy I can say is that if I was tasked with making spaghetti bolognese, or a dish that I didn't know how to make, then I'd research it online, I'd get some recipes, and I'd write a list of the ingredients. And then I'd trek off to the supermarket, I'd buy those ingredients, I'd come back, and then following the recipe and the amounts that I need and the time that I need to do it, I'd create that finished meal. And filming is exactly the same. Okay, so if you're going to venture, for example, to Swanage, and you want to create a video that shows ocean divers that haven't had the opportunity to dive on it, then you'll create this 2-minute video, which is going to sit on the website. So you'd use any resources to search for information, and then possibly we'll go back, plan a little shot list. Then you'd grab your ingredients, i.e. the footage. You'd take that footage and then you'd edit it, which is the cooking part, and then you'd publish it, which is serving that meal up. So always think about why and what you're trying to achieve. I think I'm going to drastically run out of time now, unfortunately. But I'm more than happy if you have a club and you'd like me to deliver this to your club members, please drop me an email. If you'd like me to come and give workshops once we're able to, then more than happy to do this. And I think I'm going to pass back to Stephen for any questions.